Mythic rares are the highest rarity of cards in modern sets, and as a result are often some of the most sought after cards in said sets. That's even more true for the Master series, sets designed to reprint highly sought after cards to make the game more accessible. Considering that all the cards in the set are reprints, and the stated purpose of the sets is accessibility, less playable mythics in this coveted reprint slot become an even bigger drag to open. Today, we're going to go over some of the worst mythic rares ever reprinted in a master set, and explain why they were such a disappointment. Starting us off at number 10, we have Hellkite Overlord. This is an 8/8 dragon with a mana cost of 4, 1 black, 2 red, and 1 green. It has flying, trample, and haste, meaning it can't be blocked by creatures without flying, deals excess damage to defending player, and can attack the first turn it comes into play. You can also pay 1 green to give it +1/+0 for the turn, called Fire Breathing by the community, and it lets you pay 1 black and 1 green to regenerate the creature. Regenerate is basically like a shield that stops the next time the creature would be destroyed this turn. Hellkite Overlord suffers this same fate as many other expensive, powerful creatures. It's simply too slow. While it could have a huge impact on the game, you were usually going to die the turn after you played the card because it didn't stop your opponent from attacking. Most creatures that cost 7 or more and see play have removal stapled to them or the like, allowing them to at least save you from dying even if they die to removal spell in the following turn. Overlord is also weaker to removal than it looks, as while it does have protection, you aren't going to wait until you have 10 mana to play this with Regenerate up. It also isn't the biggest and baddest creature around. So, if you're getting around mana costs, you're better off with even less practical creatures like Emmy. This card really needs lifelink or some sort of trigger ability to get you more value to be worth playing. However, it's not the most unplayable card that's gotten a reprint in one of these sets. For example, look no further than Darksteel Forge. This is an artifact for 9 mana that gives all your artifacts indestructible, including itself. This is a powerful effect, but it fails in the same way that Hellkite Overlord does, except worse. Forge requires you to have a board state to do anything. And while Overlord is slow and your opponent can easily either kill you if they have a board or simply use removal on it, they do need to do one of these things or they'll quickly lose. It can easily end the game in 2 turns thanks to its fire breathing, something that Forge can't do. So if Forge is, for all practical purposes, worse than Hellkite Overlord, why is Overlord on this list? Well, because Forge has some impractical purposes, namely casual play like Commander. Despite being weak, it is a very unique card. And as a result, it is sought after for casual play, and as a result of that, despite being reprinted, it still runs for around $30 a copy. The stated goal of master sets is to reprint cards to increase accessibility to the game. So even if a card isn't all that playable, if it's valuable, it still needs a reprint. It would be pretty weird to call Darksteel Forge a bad mythic, considering it was more than worth pulling out of your double masters packs. For this list, we'll be using a combination of these 2 factors to judge how good of a reprint the card is. Back to Hellkite Overlord. The card was not particularly well received in casual play. It just didn't do enough to end the game when compared with other Commander All-Stars like Avenger of Zendikar and Craterhoof Behemoth, and as a result only went for around $7 per copy at the time of Double Master's release. The card wasn't a terrible pull, but it was aggressively medium in every way, making it worse than the vast majority of cards at high rarity. And at number 9, we have Temporal Mastery. This is a sorcery for 5 and 2 blue with the effect where you take an extra turn, then exile Mastery. However, it also has Miracle for 1 and 1 blue, meaning that if it's the first card you draw on your turn, you can cast it for only 2 mana. Sounds good, right? Well, that's what everyone else thought too. Unfortunately, Mastery was one of the biggest flops in recent memory, or at least semi-recent memory, as it did release a while ago. Unfortunately, this was not the second coming of Time Walk as some predicted. One of the big upsides of Time Walk is that it never really gets stuck in your hand, as 2 mana is really easy to get access to. Temporal Mastery did not have this luxury. Opening Mastery was usually very bad, as most games didn't go long enough for you to be able to cast the card. Of course, the main attraction here is the Miracle cost, but that alone wasn't enough to save the card. Players quickly found that Miracle wasn't as good as it may seem, as it was very unlikely you would draw the card when you needed them. While Mastery could give you a free turn every once in a while, if you weren't prepared to take advantage of that turn, it often didn't do as much as you wanted. There were ways in older formats to make Miracle better, namely Brainstorm and Sensei's Divining Top to let you mess with the top cards of your library. However, even in this deck, Mastery was usually skipped over in favor of other miracles like Terminus or Entreat to the Angels, mostly because they were just more proactive. If you were going through the effort to stack a miracle, you wanted it to actually have an impact on the game right away, not just give you the opportunity to do something later. The main home for the card has been in gimmick decks, like Walks in Modern that just likes to play all the take extra turn spells it can. So it's maybe not a surprise to learn that Mastery isn't the most sought after card ever. However, it isn't terrible either. Running for about $6 today, it went for about $8 when it was released in Modern Masters 3, which is probably a bit better than you'd think. It's not that Mastery is really popular in Commander, though it is decently popular there, but more that it's right on the cusp of playability. Temporal Mastery can't be called a great card, but it's also not a bad card. The effect is simply too powerful to completely discount, so people are often experimenting with it and seeing if there's finally a shell that can take advantage of random extra turns out of nowhere and can deal with it rotting in their hand. Considering there's always at least the possibility of the card being good, it's not anywhere near as bad as most of the other cards on this list are to pull. And at number 8, we have As Foretold. This is an enchantment for 2 and 1 blue with the abilities where, during each of your upkeeps, you put a time counter on it. Once during each turn, you can cast a spell from your hand with a mana value equal or less than the number of time counters on this card without paying its mana cost. As Foretold has a very similar story to the last entry on this list, Temporal Mastery. It was a heavily hyped card before its release, only to be incredibly mid once players actually got their hands on it. In Standard, the card just got counters way too slow to be worth using 3 mana. And an entire card on. You needed to have a spell that you can actually cheat out and another spell that you wanted to use your mana on instead in your hand at the same time, which just didn't happen that often. It did, however, find a bit of use in non-rotating formats. The card was extremely useful with spells like Living End, which technically had no mana cost and usually required you to suspend them. Now, Living End decks could use the now banned Violent Outburst to cascade into it to win the game. However, if you drew your Living End, it was pretty awful. Some players started playing As Foretold in these decks because if you did draw into your Living End, you could cast it for free with As Foretold, essentially turning a dead card into a useful card. While this did see some play, it wasn't that popular thanks to being pretty inconsistent. While this card could turn a dead card in your hand into a live card, it required playing another card that was usually dead when you drew it. It was a bit more successful with Restore Balance. Restore Balance forced each player to discard cards and sacrifice creatures and lands until they have the same number as whoever has the least of the thing. This deck really needed to get their balance off at exactly the right time alongside a suspended Greater Gargadon, which lets you sacrifice all your lands to Armageddon your opponent. So it really needed As Foretold to get around Restore Balance's downside. Neither of these uses were really all that competitive, so it's probably not a surprise to hear that As Foretold wasn't all that sought after when it was reprinted. It held a modest price of $7 when it was reprinted in Double Masters 2, which is honestly pretty good for a card that was only ever okay and constructed. And at number 7, we have Nicol Bolas, God-Pharoah. This is a planeswalker with a mana cost of 4, 1 blue, 1 black, and 1 red. It has 7 loyalty and 4 loyalty abilities. You can +2 Bolas to exile cards from top of opponent's library and to exile a non-land card. Then you can cast the spell for free. You can +1 to make your opponent exile 2 cards from their hand. You can -4 to deal 7 damage to target opponent, creature they control, or planeswalker they control. Finally, you can -12 to exile all non-land permanents your opponents control. Bolas is a card that's as flashy and ridiculous as someone who calls himself the God-Pharoah deserves. While it is very expensive, Bolas does so much once he resolves that it's pretty easy to ride to a victory. Stealing cards from your opponent every turn means that you can't ignore him, but starting with 7 loyalty and having a +2 makes him hard to kill. The -4 is great removal and can end the game pretty handily once you deal some damage. The ultimate is a lot worse than it looks because if you have Bolas with that much loyalty, your opponent probably doesn't have anything in play anyways. This let Bolas work as a very powerful finisher in Standard and really only in Standard. The card never did anything in other older formats, which is a big deal on this list. The point of the Master set is to give more reprints of needed cards, and cards in Standard are by definition not really in need of reprints. The packs that the cards are from are still plentiful, so if you want to try and open one of those cards, you can just buy the packs of that set. God-Pharoah also didn't have a huge impact on casual play. In Commander, Planeswalkers are pretty weak. The best ones are either cards like Jugan the Spirit Dragon and Elspeth Sun's Champion, which are board wipes, or walkers like Narset Parter of Veils and Oko Thief of Crowns, which are cheap and have an impact on the game the turn you play them. The only time people really play the card is if they're playing Super Friends and just want to swarm the field with Planeswalkers, or they're just huge Bolas fanboys. It was somewhat pricey before the reprint, about $10, but that was just because it only had one print ever, and people remembered it from Standard. It hasn't done anything in a competitive format since the reprint. And at number 6, we have Geth, Lord of the Vault. This is a 5/5 legendary Phyrexian zombie with a mana cost of 4 and 2 black. It has Intimidate, meaning it can't be blocked except by artifact creatures or black creatures. It lets you pay X and 1 black to put target artifact with the mana value of X from opponent's graveyard into the field under your control, tapped. The player then mills X cards. Geth is a pretty interesting card to talk about for a few reasons, centered around the fact that it's not good. First off, Geth never really did anything. Sure, it could get you a lot of value by stealing tons of artifacts from your opponent, but that requires them to be plain stealable artifacts. Milling your opponent does put more artifacts into the graveyard for you to steal, but it also puts all the other stuff into the graveyard that they might want. The biggest downside, though, is just how much mana you're spending. To steal the first artifact, you have to pay 7 mana, and then the cost of that artifact, and comes back tapped, so you don't get value out of it right away. While it can theoretically generate a ton of value for you, in practice it was easily outran and overpowered by every other deck in Standard, and was never considered for any older formats. Despite this complete lack of usefulness, Geth was going for around $10 before a reprint in Commander 2019, which released a year before Double Masters where it was reprinted. The reprint tanked the price of Geth, so by the time it was released in Double Masters at Mythic, it was a $2 card. And with that, we've hit the real garbage of reprints on this list. Up until now, we've been looking at cards that were around $10 at release and would then tank after the reprint. And now we're looking at cards that aren't played anywhere and weren't worth anything at release. After the reprint, it's worth maybe $1 at most and isn't worth playing anywhere either. And at number 5, we have Jugan, the Rising Star. This is a 5/5 legendary dragon spirit with a mana cost of 4 and 2 green. It has flying and the abilities where, when it dies, you may distribute 5 +1/+1 counters amongst any number of target creatures. This is a member of a whole cycle of 6 mana spirit dragons, which each give you 5 of something when they die, at least for the most part. Yosei taps 5 permanents and makes target players skip their next untapped step. Kokusho drains 5 life from each of your opponents on death. Ryusei deals 5 damage to each creature without flying when it dies. The only one who breaks the theme is Keiga, who steals a creature on death, because I guess you draw 5 cards would have been too good and they didn't have any other ideas for the blue dragon. These dragons are pretty iconic and well known, but including this cycle in the original Modern Masters was pretty suspect considering the cards weren't very playable in Modern. They all had a history of at least moderate play back in Standard, but that was in Standard, not the Modern format that they were seemingly being printed for. Of the entire cycle, Jugan was the least powerful, mostly because it really needed a board state to do anything. Most of the other dragons could be sure you would have an impact on the game even if they died right away. Kokusho, Ryusei, and Yosei could help stabilize the board and give you a chance to untap again. And while Keiga did require your opponent to have a creature on board, if it did actually steal a creature, it was pretty game-winning. Jugan, on the other hand, was pretty terrible if you were casted with an empty board. If it did eat removal, you'd be in a terrible position. Whereas the point of all the other dragons was that they weren't anywhere nearly as bad into a removal spell. Still, while Jugan was the weakest, Ryusei wasn't far behind in terms of power. At the time of printing, the original prints of both Jugan and Ryusei were less than the price of a pack of Modern Masters, so they were pretty bad pulls. However, Keiga was around $5. Yosei was around $8, and Kokusho, while climbing to a price of nearly $20 thanks to being very popular in, at the time, the new Commander format. The other 3 dragons could have used a reprint, Kokusho especially, and it's pretty hard to justify not putting the entire cycle into a pack when you don't explicitly acknowledge the secondary market, as is Wizards' policy. Even if it would have been weird for Jugan to be missing, players would probably have preferred that to wasting Mythic rare pulls on this one instead of one of his siblings or one of the other much more powerful Mythics in the set. And at number 4, we have 2 cards, Akroma, Angel of Wrath, and Akroma, Angel of Fury. The first is a 6/6 legendary angel with a mana cost of 5 and 3 white. It has flying, first strike, vigilance, trample, haste, and protection from black and red, meaning it deals damage for other creatures, doesn't tap to attack, and couldn't be targeted, blocked, dealt damage by, or enchanted by anything black or red. Essentially, it was a huge keyword soup. Her color shifted counterpart, Angel of Fury, is also a 6/6 legendary angel, but for 5 and 3 red. It can't be countered, and it has a similar suit of keywords, namely flying, trample, and protection from blue and white. It also has fire breathing. Finally, it has more for 3 and 3 red, which means you can cast it as a face-down 2/2 for 3 mana, then flip it up later for 6 mana. Essentially giving you a second way to get Angel of Fury onto the field. The Akromas are pretty old cards, and have a bit of a history of competitive play thanks to being some of the biggest and baddest creatures in the game at the time. Angel of Wrath is the older of the two, coming out in Legion back in 2003, and was the premier big fatty of the game for quite some time. The combination of haste, vigilance, flying, and first strike made Akroma hard to block or attack around, taking chunks out of your opponent's life while they had a difficult time doing the same. Protection from red and black allowed it to stick around far easier than other large threats like Verdant Force. For a time, if you wanted to exhume a card into play, Angel of Wrath was your best bet. Thanks to this legacy of play and importance in the lore, Akroma was iconic enough to get a color shift in Planar Chaos, giving us Angel of Fury. However, despite having a lot of the same abilities as Angel of Wrath, Angel of Fury never really had the same impact. For one, by the time Planar Chaos was released, Akroma had been heavily power cut by other, better creatures. The card did see some play in ramp decks and Standard, but it never saw any play in non-rotating formats like the original version did. After Angel of Fury rotated out, the pair faced even worse news with the release of Rise of the Eldrazi and the printing of the Eldrazi Titans, which immediately became the best things to cheat out, at which point the Akromas had no niche at all. By the time Masters 25 finally rotated out in 2018, both cards were fairly cheap and accessible, with the only role they had to fill was in casual decks. While they were still iconic, they weren't cards players were clamoring to put into their decks by any means. And at number 3, we have Ghave, Guru of Spores. This is a legendary 0/0 fungus shaman with a mana cost of 2, 1 white, 1 black, and 1 green. It enters the field with 5 +1/+1 counters. You can pay 1 and remove a +1/+1 counter from any creature you control to make a 1/1 green Saproling creature token, or pay 1 and sacrifice a creature to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Now, we've talked about Commander a lot in this video, but it's never been more relevant than now because Ghave was designed directly for that format. It was one of the face commanders for the counterpunch constructed decks. These precons are purposefully made to be too weak to compete in the few formats that they are legal in that aren't Commander, with a few very fishy exceptions. This means that, as a rule, the cards and precons only really see play in the Commander format. This doesn't mean the cards are always less valuable, but being very easy to get access to and only really being good in one format means that only really powerful and popular precon cards maintain a high price point. Ghave, unfortunately, is the embodiment of mid, and was overshadowed by many as-banned commanders such as Corridor, Ghost Chieftain. At the time of the reprint, it was only running for about $4, which wasn't great considering the Double Masters was one of the most expensive sets to buy. Ghave wasn't the only old precon legendary that got a print at Mythic in Double Masters 2 though, and overall, they were all very underwhelming to pull. Ghave's partner in crime, Corridor, was also a Mythic in the set, and also had a similarly underwhelming price point. Cedrus the Trader King was also around the same price, and I could go on for quite a while. Making this an even bigger slap in the face is that a ton of legends from precons were printed in this set at only rare, and Wizards seemed to select which rarity they should be printed at by flipping a coin. I really want to hear the reasoning for why Shatterbang Brothers is at rare, but Ghave really needed the Mythic slot. Ghave can mostly stand in for any of the other precon commanders that were printed at Mythic, with a few exceptions. Namely, the ones that were really expensive before the reprint, like Azuri Claw Progress being $10 worth of reprint for literally no reason. Overall though, opening any of these guys instead of one of the competitive staples at Mythic was extremely disappointing for any tournament grinders. And at number 2, we have Comet Storm. This is an instant with a mana cost of X and 2 red. It also has multi-kicker for 1, meaning you can pay 1 mana in addition to the rest of its cost to kick it any number of times. It has the effect where you choose one target, then choose another one for each time you kick Storm. It deals X damage to each of those targets. This is another in a long line of Fireball style effects, which are famously either very weak or literally ending the game when they resolve. When using them against creatures, they're usually just worse than any other burn spells. For a quick example, with Fireball, you have to pay 4 mana to do as much damage as Lightning Bolt does to a single creature with Comet Storm. However, if your opponent ever has less life than you have mana, Fireball and its counterparts can end the game right away. It's not uncommon for aggro decks to place some of these cards to burn your opponent for lethal in the mid to late game. Comet Storm trades a bit of this efficiency for the ability to take down multiple targets, which has never really been worth it. Let's say your opponent has 3 3/3s in play. In order to remove all of them with Comet Storm, you have to pay 2 red and 3 to ramp up the damage, then pay 2 more to kick it twice, for a total of 7 mana. Or you could just cast something like Anger of the Gods for only 3 mana. Sure, there are additional downsides there, but players have found that it's easier to work with the downsides of other burn spells than pay the extra mana for Comet Storm. This has left Comet Storm without any real home in any format. It's somewhat popular in Commander, but it's one of those cards that gets shoved in a lot of precons and people only play because they forgot to take it out for something better. Considering this middling amount of play and the $1 price tag, seeing Storm get reprinted in Modern Masters 2 at Mythic was, well, let's call it disappointing. This was a card people didn't need any more copies of. Even if you did want a copy for your commander deck, it was in so many precons at the time and has been in so many since then that you wouldn't have had a hard time finding them in bulk bins. Not only was this not nearly as good as a pull as the other Mythics, it was worse than many of the rares in the set as well. It's hard to find an explanation for the card's high rarity while assuming Wizards had nothing but noble motives, and wasn't just trying to make the good cards more difficult to pull. Finally, at number 1, we have Tree of Redemption. This is a 0/13 plant with a mana cost of 3 and 1 green. It has Defender, so it can't attack, and the ability where you can tap it to swap your life total with its toughness. Now, this card was pretty controversial when it was revealed to be reprinted at Mythic in Masters 25, and for good reason. Not only was it only going for a couple of dollars when it was reprinted, it wasn't seen play anywhere. The only place Tree has ever seen play is in Standard, where it was used as a sideboard card to pad your life total against aggro decks. However, as soon as it rotated out of Standard, it was completely forgotten. Unfortunately for the player base, it seems that Wizards was the only one who didn't forget the card. Unlike basically every other card on this list, there really wasn't even a theoretical use for the card by the time it was getting reprinted. Comet Storm was bad, but you could ramp it up a lot in commander decks. The Akromas were impractical, but it was at least a beloved card, so players may have wanted to collect it. As Foretold at least had potential in formats like Modern. Tree of Redemption didn't do anything. It was too slow to do its job against any aggro deck in Modern and older formats, and was actively harmful in the most popular casual format, Commander, thanks to the starting life total of 40. This is made even worse by the context of Masters 25. The set had a theme of celebrating the last 25 years of Magic, and as part of that, every card had a watermark of the set symbol for their first printing. So opening a pack of Masters 25 lets you flip through all the sets printed throughout the history of Magic up to that point. It was a fun visual gimmick, but it drew even more attention to the fact that Tree wasn't even close to the best pick from Innistrad to represent the set. Innistrad had tons of great cards that could have used a reprint, like Liliana of the Veil or Olivia Voldaren. Even if you wanted to print only green cards, you could have gone with Gurok Relentless. Now, there were practical issues with this, as Gurok was a double-face card, but that's not really an excuse to choose such an underwhelming card to represent Innistrad, one of the most beloved sets ever released, in your 25-year celebration set. It's kind of a shame because outside of Tree of Redemption, the rest of the high rarity cards in the set were pretty reasonable, with Akromas being the worst Mythics. These could sort of be excused thanks to Akromas being an iconic, beloved character, but the Tree of Redemption doesn't have any excuse. True Redemption is easily the most disappointing Mythic rare they put into Master sets so far, and let's hope it stays that way. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any cards you think we may have missed, or have ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, please let us know down in the comments.